The ground trembled long before anyone saw the enemy. At first, the men on the wooden walls near Khmelnyk mistook it for distant thunder, a storm dragging itself over the empty plains of Podolia, but the sky was clear. No clouds, no wind, only a pale, dying sun hanging over frozen earth. Then the sound grew heavier, deeper, more deliberate, until it could no longer be mistaken for weather. Hooves. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. A low, relentless roar rolled over the hills, swallowing the silence. On the horizon, the land turned black as if a shadow had broken loose from the earth and was moving by its own will. Banners cut the sky like blades. Beneath them flowed an ocean of riders. No drums, no war cries, only the terrible discipline of the Mongol advance. Someone whispered, "They have arrived." Not raiders, not bandits. This was the storm that erased cities, the force that had already turned Kiev to ash. And now it stood before the last fragile barrier on the road west. By March of 1241, the name of Batu Khan had reached every corner of Europe. From scorched monasteries to terrified royal courts, from burned villages to stunned capitals, the same stories travelled faster than any army. Cities swallowed in days, armies erased in hours, rivers thick with bodies. Yet belief came slowly. Kings debated. Priests prayed. Knights polished their armor and spoke of honor while fear crept across the land like a sickness. Khmelnyk was not a great capital, not a legendary stronghold. It was a crossing, a heartbeat before the Carpathians, an unassuming point on the map where roads converged and hope made its last stand. Here, local Rus forces gathered. Hungarian detachments joined them, grim and silent. A few Polish nobles arrived, driven less by loyalty than by terror of what followed if the line broke. They spoke different languages beneath different banners, but fear, at least, needed no translation. They all faced one truth: if Khmelnyk fell, the road to Europe lay open. Across the field, the Mongol army did not pause to impress or intimidate. It did not form ranks in neat, chivalric lines. It did not announce itself with the pageantry of medieval war. It unfolded. From the northern hills, one wing slid downward like a dark tide. From the southern forests, another force emerged in perfect timing. In the center, the front line advanced at a measured pace, bows already in hand, as if the battle's ending had been written long before the first arrow was released. Each rider was part of a system refined by endless conquest. Composite bows curved like claws, capable of punching through armor at ranges European archers could barely imagine. Sabers flashed like slivers of moonlight. Lances lowered in controlled, mechanical motion. And above all hovered the invisible presence of minds that thought of war as geometry. Batu's iron will and Subedei's cold mathematical genius moving men across the landscape as though they were pieces on a living board. The first clash came not from the Mongols, but from Europe. A group of armored knights, bright crests, raised lances, iron hooves striking the ground with thunder, charged forward in a desperate display of courage. They were the old world made flesh, faith in steel, in mass, in the unstoppable momentum of a mounted charge. They lowered their visors, offered hurried prayers, and rode straight toward the dark line ahead. The Mongols did not meet them. The formation simply opened, creating an unnatural corridor in the center of the field, a gap that made no sense on a battlefield. The knights surged into it, believing the enemy had fractured. For a brief heartbeat, they thought they had broken the line of the invincible horde. Then the sky turned lethal. Arrows fell from both flanks, from concealed positions, from angles that defied expectation. Horses screamed as shafts tore into them. Men toppled, smashed inside their armor, impaled before their swords ever touched an enemy. The narrow passage became a corridor of death. As the surviving knights tried to turn back, Mongol riders slipped in behind them, sealing the exit. Metal rang on frozen ground. Blood fanned across the pale earth in dark patterns. In less than 10 minutes, the charge, the pride of Europe, was dissolved into corpses and scattered iron. They had not even reached the enemy. There had never been an enemy line to reach. Only space, carefully shaped for slaughter. On the Rus side, confusion spread like fire driven by wind. Commanders shouted for discipline, for formation, for archers to ready their strings. But terror speaks louder than orders. Men had seen what happened to the knights. They had seen arrows pierce steel and horses collapse mid-gallop. The certainty of defeat wormed its way into their minds. Some tightened their grips on spears. Others stared into the approaching mass as if already hypnotized by the end. Above them, a dark cloud formed again. Not rain, but arrows. Shields lifted in a fractured wave. Some cracked. Some men crumpled behind them. Others ran without knowing where they were going. With every second, every step backward, the line that was meant to hold the West began to tear itself apart. This was the moment the Mongols waited for. Not strength, not bravery, weakness, a gap on the left, a hesitation on the right, a unit moving when it should have stood still. Subedei saw them all, and a single subtle signal rippled through the ranks. The encirclement began. From every side, the Mongol cavalry surged inward, a tightening ring around the confused and shrinking European force. Horse archers rode in disciplined circles, firing without pause, transforming the ground into a killing field. Attempts to break through met walls of moving riders and curved blades. Every escape was answered by another wave, another line already waiting. The field became a prison of mud and blood. Screams blended into one long, shattered sound. Khmelnyk was no longer a battlefield. It was a pit opening under the weight of history. And still, in the heart of the chaos, individuals fought with a fury born of knowing there would be no tomorrow. A Rus warrior with a splintered spear used it like a club until arrows bristled from his shield like thorns. A Hungarian knight, crushed beneath his dying horse, reloaded a crossbow again and again until steel finally cut the movement from his hands. A boy who should have been anywhere else in the world held a torn banner up to the sky even when there was no one left to follow it. They did not change the end. But for a fleeting moment, they reminded the earth that men can resist even the impossible. From a distant rise, Batu Khan watched without expression as the trap closed and the last serious resistance folded in on itself. He did not shout orders. He did not celebrate. To him, this was confirmation, not conquest. Another gate had opened. Another path had been cleared. The army of the steppe did what it was built to do, and then it moved on. By evening, the noise faded. The hooves passed on. The arrows stopped falling. A strange, heavy silence settled over the land, broken only by the crackle of small fires and the low, fading moans of the wounded. The Mongol riders moved among the fallen like shadows, finishing what time itself had already decided. As the sun disappeared behind the western hills, the earth around Khmelnyk was no longer simply ground. It was a new page in history, written not in ink, but in blood. No songs would be sung about this place. No great monuments would rise. The world would not remember the name. Yet this was the moment the old Europe truly shattered. Because after Khmelnyk, there was nothing left between the storm and the heart of a continent, only cities that did not yet know they were already dead. The night that followed the Battle of Khmelnyk was colder than any living man had known. The survivors huddled among the bodies of comrades and enemies alike, the fires they had lit to keep the darkness at bay casting trembling shadows over a field soaked in blood and mud. The wind carried the stench of death across the plains, and in that chill, even the hardiest warriors felt a seed of despair take root. Rumors spread quickly, whispered from one trembling soldier to another. The Mongols were everywhere, watching, waiting, their eyes as sharp as the arrows they fired. The local peasants who had fled into the forests told of mounted riders who seemed to appear from nowhere, ghosts of the night that struck with precision and vanished as quickly as they came. In the ruined camp, commanders tried to organize what remained, but order was impossible where chaos had already consumed hope. Letters would later describe Khmelnyk as a massacre, a slaughter unmatched, but even those words fell short of reality. The horror was too vast, too sudden, too complete. Across the hills, riders scouted and reconnoitered, sending signals back to Batu Khan, who maintained a calm presence amid the carnage, his mind already moving toward the next target, the next city, the next barrier. He understood that victory at Khmelnyk was not measured in bodies alone. It was measured in fear, in the cracking of the human spirit, in the knowledge that nothing in Europe had yet learned to fight this method, this relentless system of war. By the next morning, the Mongols had pulled back slightly, leaving the field largely empty, a grotesque tableau of fallen men and shattered dreams. Survivors stumbled toward the forests and villages, carrying the stories that would grow into legend, or, in some cases, vanish entirely into obscurity, leaving only the scars upon the land. The knights, the Rus warriors, and the Hungarian detachments who had faced the impossible now moved as shadows themselves, bodies broken, minds haunted, knowing that the path to the heart of Europe was open. In the weeks leading up to the battle, European commanders had been divided, unable to agree on strategy, burdened by pride and a fatal underestimation of the Mongol threat. Letters from courts, from bishops and kings, reveal an almost childish disbelief. Armies of the steppe were considered raiders, barbarians, a nuisance that could be defeated by valor and massed men. They could not imagine an enemy who moved with the precision of a machine, who struck in coordinated waves, who understood terrain, timing, and psychology better than any European strategist could dream. The Mongols had studied these lands, learned the strengths and weaknesses of the scattered principalities, and exploited every gap, every hesitation. They attacked not with brute force alone, but with cunning, feigned retreats, ambushes from hidden flanks, and a mastery of speed and surprise that left European commanders scrambling. At Khmelnyk, these tactics were perfected. The knight's charge into the corridor of death was not an accident. It was the trap's first motion. When Subedei signaled the wings to close, the defenders realized, too late, that they had been funneled into a cage by an enemy who treated war as geometry, not honor. The encirclement was complete within minutes, a swirling vortex of horse, bow, and blade. Men fell by the dozens, the remaining few trapped in confusion, unable to escape or fight effectively. Every shout for courage was met by silence or death. The surviving units broke and fled toward the forests, but even there, Mongol horsemen pursued with disciplined patience, cutting off stragglers and leaving the field entirely in their control. By the time night fell, Khmelnyk had become a ghost of civilization, a warning written across Podolian plains in blood, mud, and shattered metal. The psychological impact of Khmelnyk on the surrounding regions was immediate and profound. Cities that had heard of the Mongol advance now feared for their very existence. Merchants fled, villages entered, and the nobility scrambled to raise whatever forces they could muster. Tales of the Mongol method, discipline, speed, tactical brilliance, and unrelenting brutality spread faster than the army itself, creating fear that paralyzed even those who were yet untouched. Khmelnyk became the name whispered in terror, a symbol that no fortress, no knightly valor, no alliances of the region could guarantee safety. Traders along the rivers avoided certain roads, farmers abandoned their fields, and a pervasive sense of doom crept into everyday life. The Mongols had not only won a battlefield, they had shattered the confidence of entire principalities, leaving a vacuum of power and morale that would shape the coming months. In this way, the battle was more than a military victory. It was a psychological weapon, a prelude to the sweeping campaigns that would carry the Mongol storm through Hungary, Poland, and beyond. From Khmelnyk, the map of Europe was no longer just lines and cities. It became a land under threat, a continent that had glimpsed the unstoppable and shivered. Batu Khan's command at Khmelnyk exemplified the Mongol strategic brilliance. Unlike European leaders, who often relied on valor, brute force, or religious sanction, he understood the importance of speed, reconnaissance, and flexibility. His cavalry moved in coordination, each wing aware of the other's positions, closing gaps, exploiting weaknesses, and maintaining an unbroken chain of pressure against the defenders. Subedei, whose reputation as a strategist had already spread across the steppes, managed the battlefield like a chessboard predicting European responses, using feigned retreats to draw men into traps and ensuring that the momentum of the Mongol advance remained unstoppable. Khmelnyk was not merely a battle. It was a demonstration of a system of war that Europe had no frame of reference for. The soldiers who survived, the scattered knights, and the fleeing peasants carried tales that could not be fully comprehended by those who had not seen it themselves. An army that moved faster than rumor, struck with precision, and vanished as if it had never been there at all. Amid the carnage, human stories emerged, small, tragic, and heroic in equal measure. A Rus soldier, broken and blooded, lifted a fallen comrade's shield to protect a group of villagers fleeing the battlefield, giving his life to create a few moments of escape. A Hungarian knight, separated from his retinue, held a narrow bridge against a squad of Mongol riders long enough for families to reach the opposite bank. Young boys and inexperienced fighters bore flags and symbols of fallen units, their fear and determination etched into every step. Yet, despite these acts, the overwhelming force of the Mongols could not be resisted. Every personal victory was temporary. Every moment of courage merely delayed the inevitable. By the time darkness fully settled over the plains, Khmelnyk had become more than a battlefield. It was a proving ground, a warning, a silent testament to the scale of destruction the Mongols were capable of, and the fragility of European resistance in the face of a war machine unlike any the world had ever known. The morning after the Battle of Khmelnyk, the plains were silent in a way that pressed on the lungs. Smoke drifted lazily from small fires, casting long shadows over frozen ground littered with the remnants of men, horses, and shattered equipment. Survivors stumbled through the mud, eyes hollow, haunted by the echoes of arrows and the screams of comrades. The European forces, once a patchwork of knights, Rus warriors, and Hungarian detachments, were scattered and disorganized. Many had fled into the forests, some hidden among reeds near frozen rivers, too afraid to move yet too terrified to rest. Word spread rapidly. Khmelnyk had fallen. Europe had witnessed, at last, the methodical efficiency of the Mongol war machine, and the consequences of underestimating it. It was no longer a rumor. It was undeniable. The Mongols could not be bargained with, preyed to, or outmaneuvered by conventional force. They were a force of nature, and Europe, as it had always known itself, was suddenly fragile and exposed. Batu Khan, ever calculating, did not linger at Khmelnyk longer than necessary. His army needed to keep moving. The principle of speed and momentum, which had served them across the steppes, applied even here, deep in foreign territory. He ordered scouting parties to continue their reconnaissance, mapping river crossings, valleys, and roadways, ensuring that the army's advance would remain fluid and that no hidden pockets of resistance could regroup undetected. Subedei oversaw the logistics. Supply lines for horse, bow, and rider had to be maintained despite the foreign terrain, the frozen rivers, and the chaotic remnants of fleeing peasants and soldiers. The Mongols understood that fear itself could be a weapon, and they deployed detachments to carry word of their approach to towns and villages ahead. Messengers told of Khmelnyk, of bodies left untouched by mercy, of arrows that found any gap in armor, of entire units vanishing in minutes. These reports were often exaggerated in the retelling, and yet even the exaggerations served their purpose. Europe, previously confident in its fortified cities and knightly valor, now trembled. As Batu's forces advanced toward the borderlands of Hungary, political consequences began to ripple through the region. Kings and princes convened emergency councils, sending envoys to the Pope, seeking aid and counsel, but the news from Khmelnyk undermined any sense of security. Local lords, who had often squabbled among themselves over borders, wealth, and loyalty, found themselves in an unprecedented position, their internal disputes now irrelevant against an enemy who did not negotiate. The psychological impact was profound. Entire communities fled preemptively, abandoning villages, fields, and strongholds. Merchants hid their goods, fearing that armies they had never seen could appear at any moment. Priests and monks interpreted the Mongol advance as divine punishment, preaching fear and submission. The Mongol method, precision, speed, encirclement, became legend even before the next battle, reinforcing the terror that had been sown at Khmelnyk. Fear, it seemed, traveled faster than steel. Meanwhile, the Mongol army moved like a living organism, its pace relentless. Subedei divided forces with careful precision, leaving smaller detachments to pursue fleeing soldiers and secure supply routes, while the main body pressed westward. Each step was calculated to maintain the initiative, to ensure that European forces could not regroup, and to exploit any sign of disarray. The survivors of Khmelnyk carried the memory of failure and told stories to those they encountered along the roads. Entire villages surrendered without a fight when the name Batu Khan was whispered at their gates. Armies that attempted to intercept the Mongols found themselves outmaneuvered, their formations broken by a combination of superior mobility and psychological warfare. At every crossroads, the Mongols demonstrated an understanding of terrain and timing that European commanders could not comprehend. Rivers, forests, and hills became not obstacles, but instruments in a symphony of calculated destruction. The westward march of the steppe was unstoppable, and Khmelnyk had been only the opening movement. Back in the land surrounding Podolia, the surviving knights and Rus warriors struggled to reorganize, but morale was shattered. The sight of the battlefield, the bodies of comrades, and the efficiency of the Mongol attack left many questioning the purpose of resistance. Some fled to fortified cities, hoping walls and gates could withstand what Khmelnyk had demonstrated, while others sought refuge in monasteries or villages deep in forests. A few noblemen attempted to rally scattered units, but coordination proved impossible. Every messenger who returned carried reports of the Mongols' cunning, speed, and cruelty. The psychological warfare was as lethal as the arrows and sabers. Fear undermined cohesion, hesitation became defeat, and retreat became survival. Europe's soldiers realized that battlefield courage alone could not counter an enemy that mastered both mind and machine, that understood the art of war as deeply as the science of it. The Mongols' movement toward Hungary after Khmelnyk was not just military but strategic, aiming to exploit the vacuum created by shattered European resistance. Cities were abandoned before their gates were reached. Supply lines of defenders crumbled under panic. Entire provinces were left empty, and peasants fled into forests and mountains, leaving only the landscape as a map of fear. Reports of Khmelnyk spread faster than any army could march, creating an invisible front of terror that slowed, scattered, and weakened European opposition before physical confrontation even occurred. Batu and Subedei understood that the mind could be conquered as efficiently as the body. Every letter carried, every whisper, every sighting of Mongol riders on the horizon reinforced the inevitability of their campaign. Amid this relentless advance, Europe began to grasp a terrifying truth. The Mongols did not fight like men of their world. Their warfare ignored pride, chivalry, and the codes of honor that had guided European armies for centuries. Victory was measured in the complete annihilation of opposition, the control of movement, and the orchestration of fear. Khmelnyk had provided a template. It demonstrated that speed, flexibility, and psychological domination could overcome larger or better armored forces. European leaders who had believed in fortifications, alliances, or sheer numbers were forced to reconsider, often too late. The Mongol war machine could adapt to anything, predict reactions, and exploit hesitation in ways the old continent had never seen. The aftermath of Khmelnyk would shape not only the next battles but the perception of warfare in Europe for decades to come. As the survivors of Khmelnyk disappeared into forests and cities, the Mongols pressed on. Batu remained on the broader goal, the conquest of Hungary and the opening of the path deeper into Central Europe. Every village they passed, every river crossing, every minor encounter reinforced the efficiency of their system. Subedei, ever vigilant, noted the formation of new defensive lines, the potential assembly of European forces, and planned his movements with precision that seemed almost supernatural. By the time the Mongol advance reached the peripheries of Hungarian lands, the echoes of Khmelnyk had already preceded them, weakening morale and creating the illusion of an unstoppable force. Europe, in its fragmented political and military state, was unprepared for the scope, speed, and intelligence of the Mongol campaign. Khmelnyk, though forgotten by history, had set the stage for an era in which fear itself became a weapon, and the steppe storm, once unleashed, could not be turned back.